Hello everyone, welcome to another Hertz Drums tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about the sampler built into the plugin. It allows you to load up external samples and assign them to any of the pads in the virtual drum kit. You can then blend them together with the samples from our libraries to customize your drum tones and achieve your own unique sound. And we'll also discuss the MIDI mapping. But first, let me show you what the sampler basically is about. So let's say we want to use the cowbell pad for playing our external samples. I'm going to select the cowbell by clicking on it, and then go to the lib sampler section of the plugin. Then I'm going to select the sampler option in the group selection menu down here. It gives us access to a whole bunch of sampler options. So now that we've assigned the sampler to our cowbell pad, the pad has 8 articulations. An articulation is basically a certain way you hit a drum or a cymbal. For example, every crash cymbal in our libraries has 2 articulations: normal hit and choke, while every snare drum has 7 articulations: right-hand center hit, left-hand center hit, right-hand rim shot, left-hand rim shot, right-hand side hit, left-hand side hit, and finally rim click. All these samples are played through one mixer channel designated to this particular kit piece, but each of them can be assigned its own MIDI note, but more on that later. Furthermore, each of the 8 articulations can have up to 6 dynamic groups of samples, meaning that a single MIDI note assigned to one articulation can actually trigger one of up to 6 different sample groups, depending on the velocity of the note. Sounds complicated, but let me show you what it means in practice. So let's say we want our sampler pad to have 2 articulations. And for each articulation, we want to have 2 dynamic groups of samples. So I'm going to choose this option for both articulations from the drop-down menus. Now I want the plugin to play this sound when the note's velocity is from 1 to 93. So I'm going to load it up to the first dynamic group using the load button. And here's the sound I want to hear when the note's velocity is from 94 to 127. So I'm going to load it up to the second dynamic group. Now for articulation 2, I want the lower velocity notes to sound like this. So I'm going to load it up to the first dynamic group. And the higher velocity notes are going to sound like this. So I'm loading it up to the second dynamic group. Let's move over to MIDI mapping. Here you can change the MIDI notes assigned to each of the kit pieces. Let's do it for the cowbell that is now working as our sampler. Now we can assign a MIDI note to each of the 8 articulations. We're using only 2 of them, so for articulation 1, I'm going to first clear the existing setting, and then assign the note D4 for this articulation. Similarly, for articulation 2, I'm going to reset the existing setting, and then assign the note D♯4 to it. I can also clear up the mapping for articulation 3, since we're not using it at all. Now here I have a MIDI item with just 4 notes in it. The first note is a D4 at the velocity of 86. So it's going to trigger the sound we have assigned for articulation 1, group 1. Then another D4 at the velocity of 112. So it's going to play the sound we've loaded up to articulation 1, group 2. Then similarly, a D♯4, velocity 86 for articulation 2, group 1. And another D4, velocity 112 for articulation 2, group 2. So let's play these notes again one by one. So this is basically how the sampler in our plugin works. I deliberately didn't want to use any drum sounds for this explanation to make it as clear as possible. Now let me give you some ideas of how you can use it in an actual musical context. So let's say you simply want to blend this punchy synthetic snare sound from a free synthwave library with an existing snare from our library. You want to use just one single external sample, and you want it to be blended in only to the hardest snare hits. Well, here's how you do that. Let's again select the cowbell and go to the sampler section. Since we're going to be using just one articulation, I'm going to clear up articulation 2. Now in articulation 1, let's create 5 dynamic groups. Since we want only the hardest snare hits to be affected, we're going to need to leave the lowest velocity groups empty, and we're going to load our sample only to the hardest hitting group. Now let's move over to the MIDI routing again. We want our sample to be played simultaneously with every hard snare hit. The snare drum has 8 articulations too, and each of them has a MIDI note assigned to it. So we're going to assign the same MIDI notes to articulation 1 of the sampler. So I'm resetting the existing mapping for articulation 1 and assigning the notes from D1 to G1, leaving out only the C-sharp 1, which is reserved for the rim click. And I'm gonna clear up articulation 2 since we're not using it. What it gives us is that the sampler is now playing simultaneously with the snare. Alright, now let's take a look at this MIDI groove. It has a bunch of ghost notes on the snare drum, so if we've set up everything correctly, they're not going to be affected by the sampler, unlike the hardest snare hits in the groove. Let's hear what it sounds like. Okay, the synthetic snare is clearly way too loud. So I'm going to go back to the plugin window, make sure I've selected the cowbell, and trim it down a little bit. Now that's better. We can also play around with the pitch. Well, actually, I like it at 0. Now it sounds great, and I'm happy with the result. Okay, but what if you had your favorite snare drum recorded in your favorite drum room with several different mics, including overheads and room mics, and let's say you had it in 2 articulations and 2 dynamic groups, and you wanted to use this whole bunch of samples with the Hertz Drums plugin? Of course, you can easily do this using the sampler functionality. This time around, we're going to be using the sampler in place of the snare drum pad, so I'm going to clear up the mapping we've set up for the cowbell in the previous example. Now I'm going to select the snare drum, go to the lib sampler page, and select the sampler in the group selection menu. Alright, now let's load up the files just as we did before. First, I'm going to create 2 dynamic groups for articulations 1 and 2. And start by loading up the close mic, or in other words, the DI samples. Now, it's worth mentioning that each dynamic group of samples can have up to 4 sound files. Their number is shown by this indicator, and when you hover the mouse cursor over it, it shows the names of the actual files. So we've recorded 4 slightly different snare hits for each dynamic group. When there's more than one sample in a dynamic group, the plugin alternates between them randomly, giving the playing a more human feel. You can also clear the entire group of samples by clicking this red cross icon. Let's do this again and repeat it for the rest of the samples. Each of these types of samples gets its own volume control in the instrument settings section of the plugin. So namely, we've got the DI, overhead, room, reverb, submic, and also additional effects samples, all loaded up into the plugin and independently controlled. Now, you don't really need to change anything in the MIDI mapping, because we're using the sampler instead of the snare pad that already had some MIDI notes assigned to it by default. But of course, you can change it if you want to. For example, since we're using only 2 articulations instead of 8, we can actually unassign the MIDI notes from the unused articulations. As you might have noticed, each of the 8 articulations has its own volume control. To get access to it, you first need to unlock the knobs. Then you can adjust the volume and lock the knobs again. In this menu, you can also save the changes, save the mapping as a new preset, or clear the current mapping. Alright, now finally, let's give it a listen. Let's play around with the ambience panel, because it feels like there's too much of it on the snare. Alright, now that's better. And I'm also curious about the sub and effects samples. Okay, this sounds fine, but we can actually trim it down a little bit. Okay, I like the way it sounds. Now let's save it as a new instrument. We just open up this menu and click on Save Instrument. When we do that, all our samples and settings are saved to a file that you can later use with the Hertz Drums plugin in any DAW. As you can see, Hertz Drums is not just a drum machine, but also a powerhouse of a sampler that gives you a lot of creative freedom and total control over your drum tones. That's all for today. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.